industry research shows that over 90% of modern applications rely on open source components and container images routinely bundled hundreds of dependencies, making the image layer one of the largest and least visible attack surfaces in the software supply chain. My name is Paul Nashawaty, and I'm the practice lead for the application development practice. And I'm joined by Mike Donovan, VP of Product Management at Docker. Mike, how you doing?
Hey, Paul, good to talk to you today. Doing great, excited as always.
Yeah, great to have you on. Why don't you introduce yourself and a little bit about Docker and what you do?
As Paul said, I'm Mike Donovan, Vice President of Product Management here at Docker. I oversee a lot of the product management practice and different product areas here, most notably our supply chain security area that has launched Docker Hardened Images this past year to great success. And so my background before sort of being a product leader was as an engineer for over 15 plus years. I had a whole nother career, as they say, and before going over to the dark side of product management.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you on. I mean, it's definitely an interesting topic, right? I mean, we see that more than half of organizations reporting experiencing at least one software supply chain security instance in the past year. This really is showing like why starting from a hardening trusted image base is really becoming the baseline requirements rather, as the best practices to move forward. So Mike, I want to just jump right in and get your thoughts on a couple of things, right? We were talking recently at reInvent. We were talking about a couple of different things. You have a big announcement coming up with regards to this. Love to get your take and when we think about talking about secure software supply chain, where do you see the biggest kind of real world risks today? Where do you see containers and why are container images such a critical choking point in the chain?
Yeah, well, there's really two trends really come to mind at first around the massive adoption of open source software, which has been a big boom for everybody and just innovation,
Sure.
but then also the massive rise in critical vulnerabilities that come out every day, new ones every day. And so, and generally associated with that, the open source software, that's what that's all the CVE industry is all about. And so because container images are really one of the main ways that open source software gets put into the supply chain, that's why we think that container images themselves are such a great control point to make sure that you're using only secure open source software. And Docker specifically, as sort of the stewards of the container ecosystem. I mean, in many ways, we take responsibility for that ecosystem. We think it's our responsibility to make sure that that entire ecosystem is secure, is getting to a place where it can become secure by default.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I mean, it's obviously an area in my practice. I talk about past, present, and future. I talk about the heritage environments that are migrating to kind of more of a current state, and then like thinking about where they're going to go in the future. And a lot of times, organizations will encapsulate heritage environments, but that doesn't make them secure. It just means they're encapsulated. But this term hardened images, right? I mean, this means different things to different teams. From a developer perspective, what it actually makes an image hardened is the way that how you really should have changed the day-to-day development and deployment workflows. Is this different from your perspective, or is it like, status quo from a developer and they should just accept it and it is the way it is? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the right approach is that security needs to always be something you do by default in order to actually have massive adoption. And so our goal with Docker Hardened Images and just, I think with Docker tooling and the platform overall has always been to create a great developer experience. And that's what's led to the ubiquity of containers, frankly. And I think it's even more important when you are dealing with security or quality because of, developers have a full-time job already. It's hard enough to do the innovation that's required to make the digital experiences we enjoy every day. And not everybody is going to be a security expert and or have time to deal with the vulnerabilities that do get inserted into open source software. So what our approach has been, the same as it's always been, is to try to bake in security practices by default, make them the most easiest hardened images to adopt. And that's really been our focus from the beginning, is just how do you enable a seamless migration to a more secure foundation that is Docker Hardened Images.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's this desire to move faster, right? Well, we see it in our research, we see that organizations are responding, 24% of organizations responded that they're looking at shipping code on an hourly basis, right? Which is incredibly fast if you think about how much the cadence in the CI/CD pipeline is. But one of the things you touched on that I think is very interesting is I've been doing trending data for a number of years, and in the CI/CD pipeline, I found that in 2022, I ran a report, and only 29% of respondents indicated that they do continuous integrated testing.
Really?
But as kind of what the time went on, 2024, that same study that I ran, that number jumped to 66%, right? And a lot of this was, the kind of the dependencies of pushing code out the door fast, right? Having the DevOps teams pushing the big green button, getting the code out the door because they're meeting their business KPIs, even though they might have had security or test QA or testing saying, hey, hold on a second, there's a problem. But it was kind of a mix between who's doing what. And the developers are often caught between the speed and security, right? So when I think of how do hardened images really kind of help reduce that tension, especially in the modern CI/CD pipelines and cloud native environments, that's a big factor here. What do you think?
Yeah. No, I think it's critical, and then the reality that the engineering organizations or developers across the world faced were results from vulnerability scanners essentially having them stop their pipeline, stop the line, and having to deal with tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities in their deployment artifacts before going into production. And so, and that's obviously just like in the testing, CI integration world that you talked about. When it happens at that point, it's too late, right? Like you're already wasting cycles. And this is, as much as I don't really like the term shift left, it's important to make those decisions much earlier and then our approach is just to do that. And in general, I think security overall, you just try to bake it in by default so that when the developer is making a decision about a dependency to pull in an open source project to use, they know that they are starting from a secure place. And I think that the other thing I definitely, as an engineer myself, or working with our users and customers, no engineer also wakes up and says, I really want to make an insecure decision. That's not a thing that they want to do. Everyone, takes a lot of pride in the security, the quality, the functionality of their software. But when faced with a decision to choose something more secure or less secure, they'll choose the one that's more secure as long as it's easy to use and seamless to adopt. And I think that's just a really important responsibility or bar to meet for anybody in this space, really.
Yeah, I think removing the friction is a big factor. I mean, one of the biggest barriers that I see from talking to organizations, CIOs and practitioners alike, the two major factors that people talk about is complexity and skill gap issues, right? And those challenges they're challenges across the board, whether it's developers or security and such. And then, I do have to say, we're about, to almost 10 minutes into this conversation, we haven't even mentioned AI, right? Because now that's a big factor here too. So I want to ask you about this, extending security to the AI infrastructure. That's a big part of how this all works together. What are your thoughts on, how these hardened images and the methodologies for MCP service, how's that aligning?
Yeah, so I think that's a critical point. And I start by reminding myself that a lot of the problems in the agent workloads and MCP space are the same problems that we've been facing with supply chain security for over a decade. So there's like comfort in that because we know how to solve them. Of course, there's new challenges with runtime monitoring, prompt monitoring, and those kinds of things. But as it relates to some of the nastiest attacks that have gone out there, or some of the malware that you see in the news, it in a lot of ways looks like regular old supply chain attacks. And so another key part of what we're doing is to secure the MCP servers that are being massively adopted as agents are taking off as well. We do this through our MCP server catalog that you can find on Docker Hub, as well as our hardened MCP servers that are part of this launch.
Yeah, well, okay, that makes sense. I like that response because you're thinking about it, right? In my mind, there's a lot of organizations right now that are kind of innovating and experimenting and trying things, but they can't use that as an excuse to provide insecure ways of doing things, right? So when I look at Docker Hardened Image or DHI, right? I look at DHI Enterprise, and I see your advanced security and compliance that's coming out. There's a growing trend towards the market, basically adopting hardening images and having it freely available, right? But what does this mean to remove the cost barrier for adoption, as well as trust and consistency across the broader developer ecosystem? What does that mean for that?
Yeah. So, well, what it means for us and what we're trying to do for the market is do for the ecosystem is set a new standard for container development all up, right? And so by launching this by making Docker Hardened Images free for everybody to use, all 26 million and counting developers in the container ecosystem, we're setting a new standard for how container development should be done, and start from that secure foundation. We think of it like security is not a right that only a few can get access to in certain enterprises, right? It's a right that every application developer should have, this applies to the existing workloads, the existing applications, as well as the new frontier of agents and AI workloads. It's all going to be there. Their containers are going to play a role in all of that. Open source software especially is going to play a role in that. The amount of software being written and dependencies being depended on is going to grow exponentially with coding agents. All of that deserves to start from a secure foundation, which is why now there's not going to be there's no paywall. It's all these hardened images the Docker hardened images are going free in the market with Apache 2.0 licensing, so that it's very permissive, so that they can be used by all sorts of open source projects as well as developers at various organizations. So we're really all about how do we secure and help the existing ecosystem, right? The ubiquitous ecosystem of containers, and then bring it into the future as agents start writing more code.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think that this is an incredibly important point that you touched on, because governance, compliance, and regulations is a big factor, right? Especially when we start thinking about things like the EU CRA. We talked a little bit about this when we were in person. There's a lot of things here to take into consideration. I also want to kind of touch on real quick is the extended lifecycle support beyond the end of life. That's a factor here, especially when you start looking at security coverage beyond, upstream or end of life kind of situations, right? Or continued CVE patches or SBOM updates. That's a big factor here. That's a challenge for many of these heritage or legacy systems. What are your thoughts on that, and how is DHI kind of helping with all this?
Yeah, so I think while it does impact heritage systems, I think it also has a rolling impact on even the modern systems that are actively maintained with the development team behind them and everything at enterprises. It's just the reality of using open source. There's we kind of looked at the ecosystem of open source software. So there's two big things that companies deal with. One was, of course, vulnerabilities. But then the other was the rolling support policies and that are happening with open source ecosystems all the time. And it's very difficult for an organization that is probably adopting thousands, if not tens of thousands, of open source projects all on their own support lifecycle, to keep track of that and to understand when to upgrade, how to upgrade. We of course want everyone to upgrade. I think it's generally the right approach, but we want to give people the control back on when they do the upgrade, so that they don't have to derail their entire backlog just to upgrade that next version to the next version of Python or Nginx. And then we want to give them the control to do it on their own time frame. So this is why we're announcing extended lifecycle support for Docker Hardened Images, where you'll get an extra 5 years past the end of life date, so that you can do that upgrade on your own time, right? And be in control of your backlog that way. And this is it's definitely one of those problems that impacts a lot of the world out there. And I mentioned the CRA. It's also part of the CRA around making sure that you do have support for everything that's out there, even if it is end of life.
Yeah, no, agreed. I mean, there's a lot of customers and industry that's kind of embracing this new way of doing this, right? We see Google, we see Mongo, we see, Circle CI, right? We see Adobe, right? These are companies that are actively adopting this approach, right? And those companies that are looking at it, they're kind of, I want to say they're forward looking, right? They're looking ahead at where hardened images are starting to become the default starting point rather than a premium add-on later, right? Because like this is something that should be done as part of the initial kind of development phase. But how does that like really reshape the shared responsibilities for security across vendors, open source communities, and enterprise teams alike? And because there's a kind of a shared responsibility that needs to happen when you're doing this development. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and it's a great point. And I think, we're not doing this alone, right? As the stewards of the ecosystem, it's important that we do this in conjunction, in collaboration with that ecosystem. And it is why so many have flocked to this announcement about making hardened images just the new default for the container ecosystem overall. I think that there's a luxury of that in my position as I get to and we manage Docker Hub. We get to work with all of the publishers, the thousands of publishers who publish their images to Docker Hub, and nearly every one of them is looking for easier, faster, better ways to deliver secure defaults for their communities, right? Their end users. And so now they have an option that is Docker Hardened Images to start building their open source projects on top of, right? And then, of course, for those organizations who need extra service level agreements or other enterprise features, we have our enterprise offering. But as far as a base default, now all these open source projects are going to start adopting DHI as their base layer. Start deploying with Docker Hardened Images, just the applications we support. They've all really flocked to it, and it's been I think it's both their desire to secure this and do what's right for the industry, but also like their end users are asking for this, their end customers are asking for this. Both sides, everybody is ready for to have a different conversation. I think that's the other thing that's really exciting for me. It's like. And I think a lot of us are probably tired of talking about CVEs and the vulnerability scans. It's like, yeah, I am too. Let's make that a right. Let's set a new standard so that we all need to start innovating in other supply chain areas, other supply chain security areas. We want the hardening to just be a default now. That should just be the default that everybody deals with.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that up because it really is. It's a new way, right? It's a new way of doing this. And again, I do like how we talked about it in the context of this discussion, where what was a premium offering is now the standard offering, right? And that's really where it comes down to.
Yeah, it should be a commodity. It's a good thing that it's a commodity, right?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
now that's what everybody should be having this. And then I think it's on the onus is now on the vendors in this space to innovate more. It should actually create more competition, more innovation that end consumers benefit from, developers will benefit from even more so. And I think that's just going to be great for the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. Well, this has been really great having you on. There's been a lot that we talked about. Where would you advise the audience to go to learn more?
I would go to everybody's favorite place, at least it's my favorite place, which is hub.docker.com. You will see all this front and center in how you can explore what's in the catalog, which open source technologies you've hardened. We got over 1,000 images now that have been hardened, and the list just grows every day, frankly. So go there, you can try this out, start pulling them down, start updating your Docker files to use these, start building your MCP servers based on this, and really just give it a whirl. And then we are always here for feedback. We have our Slack community, we have our GitHub projects. You'll be able to engage with us in many ways. So just go use it.
Absolutely. I think it's cool to kind of get out there, experiment, innovate, have fun, right? And have a good time doing this. Mike, thanks for your insights and your perspective. Really, really valuable, really cool. I think you're right. I think we're taking off in a new direction, and I can't wait to watch where it goes in the future. But also, I want to thank the audience here for tuning in. We do really appreciate you being part of the AppDevANGLE community. But for now, that wraps up this episode. And we'll be back next Wednesday with another conversation diving into the tools, trends, and talent shaping the future of application development. So whether you're deploying at the edge, building with AI, or modernizing your cloud stack, we've got you covered. Be sure to follow us on social if you have any thoughts, questions, or just want to connect. Until next time, stay curious and stay building.